Good afternoon and welcome to Every Student Succeeds Act webcast. We have just a few reminders today. The slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. Should you need technical assistance, click on the Help button. You are encouraged to submit a question at any time during today's presentation by typing in the Ask a Question tab and clicking Submit. If your screen freezes or the slides do not appear to be advancing as they should, please try exiting and restarting the sessions, as it may be an issue with your connectivity. I will now turn the call over to Dr. Chris Woolard, Senior Executive Director in the Center for Accountability and Continuous Improvement at the Ohio Department of Education. Please go ahead, Chris.
Welcome to our webcast today. This is a first in a series of webinars that the department is hosting to engage with you regarding Ohio's ESSA plan. It is critical for us to get your feedback so Ohio can craft and submit a plan which reflects the needs of Ohio's students, educators, and communities. In order for this to happen, we must gather everyone's input. Over the past several months, we have met with over 70 organizations and participated in various opportunities to share big picture about what ESSA does, what's in the legislation, what are the decision points, what are the opportunities for flexibility, and how we can start to build on Ohio's priorities in education. We are now entering our second phase of stakeholder engagement. We're really starting to dig into some of the specific issues, particularly around some of the major decision points. This includes a series of webinars, in which today is the first. Each of these webinars will have an accompanying discussion guide, which you can download on our ODE ESSA website. So in fact, if you go to the ESSA website now, you can download the accompanying discussion guide for this particular webcast. That discussion guide will include a lot of the data and information that we'll be sharing today. So today, the first of those discussions and focuses on the minimum N size for subgroup evaluation. It is a fairly technical discussion. So what is N size? N size is an important statistical determination. It's the minimum number of students for a subgroup to be included for accountability and data reporting purposes. It determines which of the federally defined subgroups are evaluated for a particular school or district, and there are several factors that need to be considered. Fairness, validity, and student privacy are all considerations in choosing N size. And while it is a very technical conversation, it is an important foundation of our accountability and improvement system. It is crucial that we focus on equity and ensure that all students can succeed and grow. The N size determination is an important determination in assuring accountability for all students in our system. So what do we have to do? Now, please note, as I've reiterated in many meetings, and if you've heard me speak before on this, is that many of the proposed rules and regulations at the federal level are still only proposed. There are still a lot more details forthcoming from the federal government. We do know that the current set of proposed regulations that are out for feedback right now do include some details in N size, and in fact, I encourage you to go to the U.S. Department site and review those regs if you so desire, and they're available for public comment. So the short part of that is that there are still a lot of details to be figured out. But what do we know? Well, we know that with stakeholder input, states must identify an N size for use in the accountability system that will be part of the ESSA plan. We know that the same N size must be applied to all subgroups. And we know, based on some of the specific language in the regulations, that 30 appears to be the maximum that the federal government will allow. States are permitted to apply for an N size over 30, but only if there's justification and data based on why that should be higher than 30. And the expectation is clear in the federal regs that states maximize the number of students in subgroup calculations. So once it's determined, what do we do with it? This determination will be used to evaluate subgroups on math and English language arts, graduation, as well as test participation. I should point out, too, that there are some new reporting requirements. So moving forward, we will be reporting data, not including that in the accountability structure, but reporting data on military dependents, homeless students, and students in the foster care system. So what are we doing now? How is N size currently addressed in our system? In the report card now, there's an N size of 30 tested students for a subgroup to be rated as part of the annual measurable objectives, the AMO gap closing measure. So currently you need to have 30 tested students for a subgroup to be evaluated at the school or district level. An N size of 40 is used for evaluation on participation in that AMO formula. So again, in the current AMO structure, 30 tested students for a subgroup to be evaluated, but 40 for test participation as it relates to that participation demotion in the AMO formula. And ODE generally uses an N size of 10 for reporting purposes on the various aspects of data that's available on the report card and the advanced reports and so forth. Based on some analysis that was done nationally a few months ago, it's our understanding that Ohio is among 23 states that are currently using an N size of 30 or more. The majority of states are using a smaller N size than 30. And that was based on data on what states are currently doing. All states, as part of their ESSA planning, will be making these new determinations moving forward. All right, so what we're going to do with the rest of the webcast is we're going to start digging into some data and showing some simulations and some simulated data about what some potential options would be. But first, we're going to utilize some of the technology that's available on this webcast. So we're going to ask you to weigh in. Please note that in our poll questions today, these are anonymous, so we would like you to chime in. But just thinking, generally speaking, as a policy and on principle, if we're thinking about students and subgroups and students in these vulnerable populations across the state, if I was going to ask you, what is an acceptable percentage of students to exclude from a subgroup calculation, what number would you think would be an acceptable percentage? So thinking about what's an acceptable percentage of students to be excluded from the subgroup calculation statewide. We've got a few choices on here and some categories, and we're going to give you a few seconds to weigh in on that data. Okay, again, give you a few more seconds. We're seeing some data pop up here, but again, the initial question is, what's an acceptable percentage of students to exclude from a subgroup calculation? I'm going to give everybody about 10 more seconds to chime in. Okay, well, thank you. I see a lot of folks have submitted some data, and we're now going to share those results with the audience. Okay, so if this is working correctly, the audience should see those results. So we ask those on the call, if you're thinking about just from a policy perspective, what is an acceptable percentage of students to exclude from the subgroup calculation? About 60% of you said 0 to 5%. Another 35% said somewhere between 6 to 25. And I think generally speaking, what you're seeing is when asked this question of how many students is acceptable to exclude, the notion is you want to try to have as many of those students in the subgroup calculations as possible. And I think that again bears out in some of that data that we've seen on our poll today. So building on that, we're going to share some statewide analysis. The following table that you're seeing on here looks at what percentage of students in each subgroup statewide would be included in the accountability system based on N-size determinations. So again, we're looking at all students across the state and how many of those students are actually included in their school subgroup evaluation. Again, 30 is the current policy, which is the bottom row on this table. So you can see at an N size of 30, we have about 78% of the students with disabilities statewide that are included in their calculation. About 98% of economically disadvantaged students, about 89, almost 90% of African American students. Decreasing the N size would include more students in their respective subgroups statewide. And you can see that by some of these simulations. We've got 30 on the bottom, but you can see what some of those percentages would be at 25, 20, 15, and 10. As a general rule, decreasing the N size would include more students in subgroups. This is especially pronounced with students with disabilities and English learners, as well as African American, Hispanic, multiracial, and Asian Pacific Islander students. For example, take a look at the yellow columns. If you'll notice that when we look at English learners and Hispanic students, right now with an N size of 30, only a little over half of students are included. Only 51, almost 52% of English learners and about 51% of Hispanic students are included statewide. So right now at an N size of 30, almost half of the English learners and half of Hispanic students are excluded from their school-level subgroup analysis. Adjusting the N size to 10, for example, would increase those numbers to 80 and almost 83% respectively. That's an example in those yellow columns. So if we look at, for example, using a benchmark of 95%, it's kind of that similar benchmark that's required for expectation. So if we were going to use a benchmark of 95% of students in a subgroup included in their subgroup analysis statewide, we can demonstrate how different N sizes would have different impacts. We're going to highlight some colors on this chart. The ones that are in green show if and where either a 95% threshold is met or the highest that's available on this simulation. All right. So we're having a little technical difficulty with our screen, but I do want to kind of point out a couple of things, and we'll go through this sort of cell by cell. So again, looking at students with disabilities, based on our N size of 30, about 3/4 of students, 78% of students are included in their statewide analysis. In order to reach that 95% threshold of students statewide included, you would have to get to an N size of 15. With the economically disadvantaged students, 98% are in fact covered by 30 and meet that threshold. If you're looking at English learners, only a little over half of students are included at the current N size of 30. Moving that to 10 would get to about 80% of English learners. For African American students, 89, almost 90% of students are included at an N size of 30. To get to that 95% threshold, you'd have to get to an N size of 15. Again, as I mentioned earlier, in that column on Hispanic students, almost half of Hispanic students are currently excluded from their subgroup analysis. To get the highest we could get at an N size of 10 would be about 82-83%. You can see some similar trends with multiracial students that are currently only about 36-37% are included at 30. Moving to 10 would get to approximately 81%. And with our Asian Pacific Islander students, right now only about 44% of students are included in the subgroup analysis. At an N size of 10, that would increase to approximately 74%. So again, this is a useful dialogue starter in understanding where we are at with our current policy and thinking of implications for how many students are included or excluded from their school-level subgroup analysis. And we can look at this in different ways, and we've included a few charts. And I'll note, too, that you're seeing this data on all the slides. All this information is available in one place in the accompanying discussion guide also. So we can plot this data to look at how each subgroup is included at each possible N size, kind of at what is it at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. The following chart that we have up here now looks at what percentage of just the economically disadvantaged students, the students with disabilities, and English learners. And you can kind of see how that plays out when you look at each possible N size. Looking at economically disadvantaged students, there really is not much impact at all in the reduction of the N size, which is already at 98% with an N size over 30. But you can see how the students with disabilities subgroup changes in that N size do have a trend, and you can see at which point more of those students are included in their analysis. Again, you can see similar trends with English learners. On the next slide, we pulled out, again, some additional subgroups on some of that similar analysis, so you can see the trends at each particular interval of N size decrease. So here on this slide, African American students, approximately 90% are currently evaluated at the school level, but that increases as you decrease the N size. You can see some pretty dramatic trends when you're looking at Hispanic students, Asian Pacific Islander, and multiracial students. So we've looked at some of that from a statewide perspective, and we're going to start to drill into that in some additional ways. In the next section, we're going to look at some district-level analyses. And so we're going to look at the percent of traditional districts by the number of subgroups. So when you look at all districts across the state, how many subgroups are included in their analysis, how many subgroups are included in their AMOs, and what the impact would be of decreasing that. Now, for discussion purposes, in the following sets of slides, we're going to be looking at essentially three different options, which are 30, 20, and 10. And that's not to suggest that those are the only options, because obviously there are options such as 25, 15 that can be considered and that were evident on the previous slides. But for discussion purposes, we're going to look at 30 and 20 and 10 to see what some of those trends are. So you can see what that would do to the number of subgroups evaluated at the district level in this slide. We're going to look at a few other district level slides. As many of you likely know who are very familiar with our data system and our data analysis, the Department of Education does have a district typology that we use to analyze and sort demographically similar districts, which is a helpful analysis, and all the information that is available on our website. But we're going to look at a few of those important slides today. So in this next slide, we're going to look at our Ohio 8 districts, which are our large urban districts. Our Ohio 8 districts are currently being evaluated on most subgroups already, but you can see how potential decreases in that N size would affect the number of subgroups for our Ohio 8. On our next slide, we can see that decreasing the minimum N size would have an impact in other areas of the state, including small rural districts. For example, our Type 3 districts, and these are districts which tend to be in small towns and rural counties that have low levels of racial and ethnic diversity and low levels of poverty. With these districts, they would obviously have more student groups evaluated as the N size decreases. You can see similar trends when we look at graduation. So again, we will be required to disaggregate this analysis for graduation, and you can see a mode shift. As the N size decreases, the more districts have more subgroups evaluated. Now we will turn again to a school level analysis. And I know that I'm running through these slides fairly quickly, so I'll reiterate that, as part of the discussion guide, you were going to have all these and can dig into this in much more detail on your own time. But again, to run through some of the high-level analyses, we can look at this at the schools. And I think when compared to the district-level analysis, that the differences are much more significant at the school level. But you do see similar trends in similar directions. So this first chart looks at all schools across the state. Decreasing the N size would have a corresponding increase to the number of subgroups evaluated in schools. And you see a shift in the mode number of subgroups that are evaluated. And again, this first slide is for all schools. Digging into the typology a little bit, the Type 6 suburban districts. So we look at schools that are in our Type 6 suburban districts, which are our large population, low poverty districts. These are probably the areas that are most impacted by potential changes in N size. Decreasing the N size would lead to many more subgroups being evaluated in suburban schools. And you can see that on this particular slide. On the following slide, we are going to look at how these simulations would impact community schools. And note that due to their many with small student populations, there are many community schools that are not evaluated at all with subgroups. Decreasing the N size would both increase the number of schools that are evaluated as well as the number of subgroups that are evaluated in community schools. All right, so we've fairly quickly shared a lot of data. And again, as I mentioned earlier, as we were looking at some of this, we've laid out some options. These are not the only options, but obviously for discussion purposes, they're sort of helpful. You can see the impact of decreasing N size essentially across the board will increase the number of subgroups that get evaluated, as well as the number of subgroups statewide that are captured in their respective schools' analyses. But for discussion purposes, we can look at some of these options. So again, these are not the only options. For example, 15 could be an option, 25 could be an option, but they're useful for discussion. So if we look at option 1 as being N of 30, which is essentially the status quo, and option 2 is N being reduced to 20, and option 3, which is N being reduced to 10, which is also the N size that we use for masking purposes when it comes to reporting data to make sure that we're ensuring student privacy. So if we look at option 1, which is essentially the status quo and maintaining that N in 30. This is the current N size and would not result in significant changes to the accountability system. There is one potential exception to that. Again, right now in the current AMO structure, we are using an N size of 40 for participation. As the rules and regs get finalized at the federal level, there is some question about whether we're allowed to continue that practice. But under that current determination, there are a significant number of schools that are only evaluated for the all students and the white non-Hispanic subgroups. About half of English learners and about half of Hispanic students across the state are not included in their school level analyses. And statewide, we about 3/4 of students with disabilities are included in their school analysis. So again, at option 1, which is that status quo, it's the least amount of change to the accountability system. But there are some data that suggests that there are many students, particularly English learners and Hispanic students, that are not included in their respective school subgroups. Another option to think through is decreasing that N size to 20. Doing so would significantly increase the amount of students with disabilities, English learners, Hispanic, Asian, and multiracial subgroups that are evaluated. Even so, some subgroups would still remain below that 70% mark. This chart that you can see here is based on the simulations of how many subgroups would be added to district and school evaluations compared to the current policy of 30. So, for example, if the N size were changed to 20, we would see almost 1,200 schools that would add one subgroup to their subgroup analysis. So you can see how that plays out, of how many districts and schools would be adding how many number of subgroups. Option 3, which is an even more significant decrease in the N size, of decreasing that N size to 30, would result in a significant increase in all subgroups of students included in the accountability system, with the exception of American Indian, which we have a very small population statewide. But dropping the N size to 10 would result in a significant increase of all subgroups being included and all students statewide being included in their respective school evaluations. The chart, similar to the last chart, shows based on simulations how many subgroups would be added to the district and school evaluation compared to the current policy of 30. We can see that most schools would gain at least one subgroup, but even more would gain more than one. So you have about 1,200 schools that would gain one subgroup, another 800 schools that would gain two. You can also see that those changes at the district level. So changing to 30, you would see many more subgroups added to district level analysis. Again, just for some discussion purposes, here's an example. This is a profile of a K-4 school that if the subgroup if the N size was adjusted from 30 to 10, this is a school that would gain 7 additional subgroups, and you can see some of the data that it makes up. And this is some actual data from a school in the state. So we've talked through a lot of data. A few considerations. So again, Ohio, based on stakeholder feedback, is going to have to make a determination for what that N size needs to be moving forward as part of the ESSA plan. A few considerations. And first of all, I think it's important to reiterate, we've looked at a lot of data, and the N size has a tendency to be a very technical discussion, but it has an important impact. Ohio must ensure that all students are achieving and growing. The N size determination will have an impact on the report card. The related considerations for ESSA is, first of all, that Ohio must review and possibly revise its gap closing measure. All right, so currently we are using the AMO. We know that moving forward in ESSA, we must continue to measure the growth and the improvement of the subgroups in math, English language arts, and graduation, but we do have a need to review and potentially revise that measure based on feedback. Additionally, one of the new requirements for accountability in ESSA is having an English learners measure on the report card. So previously, English learner proficiency had been part of Title III and reported separately. There is a new requirement that accountability systems moving forward have a specific indicator for English learners. And this is in addition to the achievement and graduation analysis that we mentioned previously. This is a new indicator that's about English proficiency for English learners. We must have that indicator on the report card, and that these end-size considerations will have an impact on that indicator. And finally, the end-size determinations has implications for the participation rate. So ESSA does require states to enforce assessment participation. All students and subgroups must meet the 95% participation expectation. And this is addressed in more detail in the current proposed regulations that the feds have published, and I encourage you to review those. But one question that has been raised about this is how this determination and decisions around end size might impact participation determinations. For example, if a state were to move to an end size of 10, and in some conversations that we've had with other states, there are states that are considering adjusting their end size to 10, but have to enforce a 95% participation rate. In reality, that would translate to an effective participation rate of 100%. So again, 95% of 10 would be 9.5, and so if states move to a smaller end size, there are some questions about how that would impact participation rate. And we do expect nationally some public comments to the U.S. Department regarding this particular question about how participation is impacted by end size. So again, going back to using some of the technology, we've shared a lot of data today. And this data is all available for download in the discussion guide. But we're also going to give a poll to get some more feedback. I point out that we're just going to do this quick poll to get a sense that the folks are online. This is not the only opportunity to weigh in on this topic. You can continue to provide feedback through multiple mechanisms. But just based on some of the data that we've shared today, and based on some of that initial poll question, which we heard from you that it's important to include as many of the students in the subgroup analysis as possible. If you had to choose from these three options we picked today, which option would you recommend? Keeping that status quo at N at 30, reducing it to 20, or reducing that N size to 10? I'm going to give you a few seconds to ponder over that, and then we will share some results. Okay, I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds. We've heard from about a little over a half. The other half of you, don't be shy. Please chime in. You got about 5 more seconds for your answer. Okay, so thank you for chiming in. We're going to share those results. So again, based on this quick analysis today, and I fully understand that we're sharing a lot of data and have had a quick conversation, and this is not meant to be the end-all, be-all of this feedback. But just based on what you're hearing today, we can see about a little over a third would think about keeping that status quo. About a third would think about dropping that in size to 20, and about 23%, a little less than a quarter, would consider dropping that in size to 10. Big picture, about half the people on the line would suggest reducing that in size from the current at 30. So again, this is not, and I emphasize, this is not the only opportunity to weigh in on this topic. You can continue to provide feedback through multiple mechanisms. We were going to be conducting a series of regional meetings. There is going to be some statewide survey opportunities. I know, or I can imagine that there are many organizations and associations that are considering submitting some recommendations in writing to the state as part of this. But this is useful. There is, there's a lot of data. We've shared a lot of data today. So what we're going to do now is that now is our time to connect the audience with your questions. We do, using the chat feature of this, we are going to open this up and address some questions. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we will try to address some of your questions now. Okay. We had one question about why do we not see the gifted subgroup. So this determination in particular for ESSA is specific to the federally required subgroups for subgroup accountability. At this point, the gifted subgroup is not one of those federally required subgroups. But it would, you would assume that this would apply to that subgroup moving forward. So we're sharing the federally required subgroups. We're not showing gifted today, but that would likely apply. Another question relates to, is there a student data privacy issue when you lower the N size? I think that this is something that we would be very much hearing your feedback in much more detail. But I would also point out that our current policy when reporting data is based on that minimum N size of 10. And so that's a long-standing policy that we've had, which is part of why when we looked at options today, that we did use that 10 as one of the options. So that's been a policy that's been in place for years with data reporting in the system. Okay, and just so you know, you've heard my voice a lot today. I am not the only person sitting at the table at ODE. I also have Mary Ann Motley, who's our Director of Accountability here, and as we get into some technical questions, she's going to chime in on a few things. And in fact, that's my cue to send this next one to Mary Ann. And it's a question about alternate assessments and the CAP and how those demotions might be affected by this.
Sure. The question is around would the alternate assessment CAP demotions change? And the answer is no. Those are always based on all tested students, but what you might see is you've got additional subgroups that are being evaluated. When we don't evaluate a subgroup because they have too few students, they simply are not part of the calculation and they don't either help or hurt the AMO letter grade. So theoretically, if you do have additional subgroups that are being evaluated, then you would have additional students in that mix, some of whom could be alternately assessed and could be subject to that demotion.
Okay, thank you. All right, on the next question, it was clarifying the differences between changes to N size of 20 and N size of 10. So in the slides, we looked at a couple of tables when we looked at options. Those tables said, on the N size versus 20, and we'll see if we can pull that up there. Which, yeah. Okay. So when you look at this table, and this is if we went from 30 to 20, this is what would the impact be for schools and districts. So an N size of 20. There would be about 1,800 schools that wouldn't add any subgroups. That would be compared to where they're at right now. They would have the same number of subgroups. About 1,100, almost 1,200 would add one subgroup. Likewise, at an N size of 20, the majority of districts, about 422 districts, would not add any subgroups to their evaluation at 20. About 140 or so districts would add one subgroup. Compared to changing that to, on the next slide, if we looked at 30, you can see how the number of subgroups would increase. So by going to 10, only about 200 districts would remain at the same number of subgroups evaluated now. Many would add one, many would add two. And at the school level in particular, you can see moving from 30 to 10 would result in many districts adding many subgroups to the subgroup analysis.
Okay, so there was a question asking how much will this cost districts to decrease the N value and report additional data. And we want to make clear that data are reported for all students, including things like their racial makeup, whether or not they're economically disadvantaged, limited English, or economically disadvantaged, regardless of whether we actually use the data to evaluate that subgroup. So every student is given labels already. So these are data that we already are getting from the schools to determine the subgroup size initially. So there wouldn't be additional data reporting specific to these 10 subgroups.
Marianne, what would be the reasons for excluding English language learners and other subgroups?
Actually, this is Chris. We've got a couple different questions that are related to this, and we're going to go back to there were some questions related to our statewide analysis. Give us just a second as we pull up that slide. All right, so you should see our statewide analysis. And the question is, what are some reasons for exclusion? These would be students that are in a school that do not have enough students in the subgroup to be calculated. So basically right now, if you look like Hispanic students, for example, and so again, only about half of the students are included in their schools. So this is based on whether they're included in their school's subgroup analysis right now. So if you're in a school right now and we have an N size of 30, if you have 29 Hispanic students in your school, that school would not have that subgroup analyzed for AMO purposes. So the reason they're not included statewide is because whatever school they are in would not have enough students to actually be evaluated for that subgroup. So what you're seeing is almost half the students, half the Hispanic students across the state are in schools that currently do not have enough students in that subgroup to be evaluated. By reducing the N size, more of those students would be included in more of their school's analysis. And I know that I saw there was one question on there too, again, clarifying that this state analysis is whether they're included in their respective schools' subgroup analysis.
Okay, we'll take another question. There was a question asking what is the age range that was used for this analysis? And it wasn't so much an age range, but a grade range. Right now we look at grades 3 through 8, and then the students that are either taking Geometry or Integrated Math 2 and ELA 2. Those are the students who are included specifically in the gap closing element of the report card. So when we were looking at subgroup size, we were looking at students specifically in those grades.
Marianne, thank you. Chris, will these sessions be recorded and posted for later viewing for those who couldn't join us live?
Yes, this webinar as well as all the other webcasts that are in this series will be recorded and put out there, and I know our social media folks will be sharing those, and please spread the word on that. And again, you can download the discussion guide, which has this data in it also.
We had a question from one of our participants who asked whether or not the N size could be phased in. For example, 1 year the N size would be perhaps 30 and then decrease in 2 years to a fewer number.
Yeah, so the question is whether it's a possibility to phase in a decrease in N size. And this is an interesting one. It's actually one I heard in conversations with some other states recently. And I think one of the challenges in ESSA is, again, how this data is then used. So on the school improvement side, again, ESSA does require states to identify the lowest 5% of performing schools for comprehensive support, and then in that next tier to identify schools for targeted support based on achievement gaps on the subgroup analysis. There are some requirements in there on that targeted identification that require schools that have been identified as targeted analysis that are not meeting subgroup targets to then have more rigorous interventions as part of the lowest 5%. And so that makes it challenging to be changing N sizes when some of the interventions that are required for school improvement are based on that analysis. Okay. Again, I think we're sort of sorting through the last few questions here. I know we had we had some questions about the methodology in which data that we use for the simulation. More of that information about the methodology for the simulation is available in the discussion guide. This is based on 2014-15 data. And again, that end-size rule, what we're looking at is based on that 14-15 data, how that, using end sizes as of 30, which is that current policy, and how potential decreases of that would impact. So again, more information is available in the discussion guide. Okay, we've gotten through most of their questions. There's a few of some very, very technical questions we may be getting back to some folks on. I know that there are a lot of questions about this topic. It is a very technical topic. By all means, continue to provide us feedback on this. I think that some of the questions that we were seeing today are sort of thinking through some of the implications. So if Ohio did decide, for example, to decrease the end size based on stakeholder input, there may be questions about implications of those things and how that might impact your district or your school or your community. We encourage you to sort of think through some of those technical things. Share those with us. There are multiple ways to do that. Again, we do have on this slide you can see the website that we have. It's ESSA specific. There is a dedicated email box for ESSA questions. That is a good place to share feedback, and especially if you get into some of those sort of technical questions and thinking through some of these in more detail. All the materials and documents will be posted to this website. You can sign up for email alerts specifically for this. All of the webinar series, and so if you haven't seen that already, we do have a series of webinars over essentially the next month and a half. All those dates are posted on the website. I believe we have a slide here so that you can see those now. Next week we're going to be talking about the flexibility option of using nationally recognized high school assessments as state assessments in high school. So I encourage you to participate in these topic-specific webinars. Again, all that information will be available on the website. You will be able to download the recordings as well as the accompanying discussion guides. Our social media folks will be pushing this out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we will be having a already scheduled series of regional meetings that will be starting late summer, early fall. So there's a lot to think about. I appreciate everybody being part of this conversation today. It's an important one. It's technical, but it's important in determining how we ensure that all students are succeeding in the state, and it's an important part of our ESSA plan. I encourage you to continue with the dialogue and let us know your additional questions. Again, here's the upcoming webinar schedule. Thanks for your time and feedback. Hope to see everyone next week, 3:30, Nationally Recognized High School Assessments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's webcast. We appreciate your participation.